Welcome back to Meeting Government's Mobile Mission, sponsored by Mobile Iron, on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and my guest is Sean Frazier, Chief Technology Evangelist for Mobile Iron's public sector practice. Now, Sean, in the last segment, we were talking about adoption of mobile in the enterprise sector. Let's get into what things look like in the public sector today, coming from where we were 5 or 10 or 15 years ago to now, current day.
Sure. So I think it's very similar. So you have a lot of the same concerns and the same requirements in the public sector that you do in enterprise, which is you have a much younger workforce coming in. They have as we talked about earlier, they have the kind of the cultural mobility as part of their DNA. So you have to address that. And typically the mobile understanding in public sector has always been BlackBerry. When you talk about mobility in public sector, and you still see this today where folks are carrying two devices. They'll carry their BlackBerry and they have their iPhone or whatever their kind of personal preference device is. And BlackBerry was very good at delivering email, which at the core of what we thought about, 10, 15 years ago, that's really what you want to do, is you want to get your email on your phone and you can respond to emails very quickly. But again, as the applications came in, that platform kind of didn't really satisfy that requirement of being able to deliver apps. So you have this kind of convergence of the old thinking of here's where we were, and again, the perception is reality, where we believe BlackBerry is a much more secure platform, so we want to develop to that. But yet you have a younger workforce coming in with the expectation of mobility that comes from the other side. So you have that challenge.
So in the government space, we have this retirement tsunami, if you will, of the baby boomers who will eventually be moving on to their retirement, and the government will be replacing them with younger workers, more fresh out of college in the early 20s, late 20s. They have an expectation of this digital capability. They want it in their personal life. They want it in their work life. Talk to me about how the public sector, the government, is going to reconcile that.
Well, I think that, it's kind of deja vu all over again. We saw this in enterprise a few years ago. Again, the first stab at this was, give the folks devices that they can use in BYO and let them bring those in. Then they said, well, we can't do that because that doesn't fit our security posture. So they kind of pivoted to, well, there was a concept called COPE, which is corporate owned and personally enabled, which means that, I as an organization buy it and I give it to you, but it's an iPhone and you can kind of act like it's your phone. That didn't work so well either. What that really did is that forced people to carry around two iPhones. So instead of carrying around a BlackBerry and an iPhone, you carried around your corporate iPhone and you carried around your personal iPhone, because you could always do things quicker and easier on your personal iPhone. So we've kind of gone back again from the COPE to the concept of BYO, or using the personal device. And I think that the challenge that public sector has with this is they need to come to the realization that this is what enterprise did, and it's probably going to happen in their environment too, because people and users are like water. They will find a way. And if you don't give them the tools they need and mobility tools that they want to use and are kind of compelling for them to do their job, they will use their personal device, or even to the extent of forwarding out their agency emails to personal emails, so they can use their personal device to kind of consume that and reply to that. So that's the challenge, is that, and we in the industry call it shadow IT, where folks are going to go off and do their own thing outside of the purview of IT, which is always a dangerous thing.
So you touched on it a little earlier, but let's dive into it a little deeper at this point, and that is the concept of mobile adoption in the public sector versus mobile adoption in the enterprise space. Talk to me about similarities, differences, what we can glean from that.
So I think in the public sector, there are a unique set of challenges. There are NIST guidelines. There are security requirements that come out of the intelligence agencies for kind of certification and accreditation of security platforms. So those are unique challenges to public sector that we and others have been working towards over the last couple of years to make sure that we adhere to those accreditations, because those are important for public sector. But all the other challenges are things we've seen before. So mobility in and of itself is things we've seen in enterprise, and it's all exactly the same as anyone like Citibank or American Express has dealt with over the last several years, where same thing, where they've had younger and younger people coming in. They've all got iPhones, and they're all kind of hip and cool, and this is the device they want to use, and you have to give them the kind of form factor, but not only the form factor, but really the applications that are compelling for them to use. And again, it always kind of, to me, always dovetails back to applications, because that is the compelling use for mobility.
And of course, applications is something that we'll get into in much more detail in the next segment. So we go from COPE to BYOD, right? Talk to me about that process and some of the concerns and considerations around that, particularly on security, and some other things?
Well, I think, in public sector, it's probably one of the areas where COPE can work more effectively. Mm-hmm. Again, it's a fine line because you can't exercise too much control, because the more control you exercise, the less capability you give your end user, and that's kind of the kiss of death in mobility. But I think that because of privacy concerns and certainly because of security concerns in the public sector, it would make a lot more sense for the organization or the agency to buy a device and layer on the security that they can. And again, don't make it arduous. Don't make it so the user can't use their device, but then hand that to the user and say, okay, here's the device you can use. Here's the iPad. Here are the applications we're going to provide to you. But I think the important thing is to not lever too much security on it. But I think, for some agencies, BYO will be a real thing. I think you look at it's all use case by use case. You look at FirstNet. So FirstNet's a good example where it's first responder network, where a lot of providers are getting together and kind of talking about how to provide a very seamless capability around first responders, where you can kind of stand up services and then tear them down very quickly. So in that environment, it's going to be BYO, because you're going to have, firemen and policemen and all kinds of different people, volunteers even, who are going to come in and probably bring their device and need to be able to get alerts and need to be able to get access to content right away on their device. And that's always going to be a BYO situation.
What are your customers telling you about the implementation of mobile in the public sector?
So I think it's challenging. It's hard. One of the, can we talk back to what we talked about before, where, if you think about mobility as an IT asset and you treat it the way you've always treated traditional IT assets, you will struggle. So that's one of the areas where I think some of our customers in the public sector have struggled. And I understand that it's you kind of out over your skis a little bit when you start thinking, okay, well, I got to change my process around mobility. I can't do it the same way that I deployed firewalls and desktops and all these other things that I do. But you have to do that. I mean, that's kind of the leap of faith you need to make in public sector, is that mobility is going to be different. And by the way, it's all going to be mobile at some point, right? So all these, as you go through your upgrade process from Windows 7 to 8 to 10 to 12 or whatever version they come out with next, it's only going to become more mobile, not less.
I like the point that you made in the last segment about the security concerns related to, it's much more likely that you would drop your phone maybe in a subway station somewhere as opposed to your laptop or your desktop, right? Talk to me about those considerations on the security front, which we haven't faced before.
Sure, and that's one of the reasons why kind of the way you build your applications are so important, and the way you manage your mobility is so important, because the ability to, the platforms are very secure, and they've become more secure over years, but certainly, if you lose a device, there's always that risk that someone's going to be able to figure out a way into that phone and get access to that content. So you employ tools and capabilities that allow you to manage that, so that if a phone gets reported lost, then you can either wipe the entire device if you own it, or if you don't own it, you can at least wipe your content as an enterprise and things that you care about. So these are things that mobility technology companies like us and Apple and others have thought about over the years of kind of making it as seamless as possible, so that you give the enterprise the tools to deal with that situation, because it happens quite a bit. I know our founder comes out all the time to DC, and I think he's lost his phone twice in cabs, right? So it happens to everybody. It happens to me. It happens to anyone who has a device, because it's just so easy to do. And that's something we haven't had to deal with in the past.
There has been this perception, I believe, in the past of security and usability being mutually exclusive. With the short time that we have left here in this segment, can you tell me if that's still the case, and if so, why?
So it's a sliding scale. So, and I mentioned earlier about how you can't make things so secure that you can't use them. So it's a balance that you have to find, and I think this is the challenge to public sector, and it was the challenge to enterprise 5 years ago when we first started deploying enterprise apps in mobility around iPhones and iPads and Android devices and even Windows devices. So you have to find the right balance, and it's always a matter of protect what you can, accept some risk. There's no perfect solution. You're going to have to understand that, and I think that is another challenge for public sector, is they want the perfect solution, the perfect nut where nothing can get in or out, and that doesn't exist in mobile.
We're going to pause here for a short break. My guest today is Sean Frazier. He is the Chief Technology Evangelist for Mobile Iron's public sector practice on Meeting Government's Mobile Mission, sponsored by Mobile Iron. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and you're listening to federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.